Hello, everybody. Welcome. Just before we start, just a couple of minutes because there's still people coming in. So if you wouldn't mind, if there are spaces to the ends of your rows, please move in to fill those so that people coming late can sit on the aisle. So if you wouldn't mind, that's very kind of you. Thank you. We're starting in 2 minutes. Welcome everybody. Welcome to this exceptionally important meeting that we're holding this evening, entitled Why
Story, which involves me to a certain extent. Long years ago, in the 70s, someone walked into the offices of New Left Books and New Left Review, now Verso Books, and introduced himself to us, and he had a manuscript. His name was Philip Agee. He had been a senior CIA agent in South America, and he had finally broken. He couldn't face the suffering and torture that they were being inflicted on South American political prisoners, teaching local torturers how to torture. And Phil said, I just couldn't take the sound of screams coming from the room next door. If you wanted to know what broke me, that's what broke me. And Philip Agee wrote a book called Inside the Company, which gave an account of what had been happening in South America. Because in those days, there was no internet. Books had to do the business. And he said, perhaps you should publish the book. And we said, well, that would be great. But we think this book deserves a huge readership. At the time, we were a very small publishing house, and said, we can't do it. And it's in the interest, it's in your political interest. And we went to Penguin. And this will never happen today because the mainstream has become part of the problem. But Penguin Books took on Phil Agee's book Inside the Company And within 2 years, 6 editions had been published, and each edition was published in 20,000 copies. So the book was translated, but no one at that time, this is why I'm telling you the story, no one at that time said that Philip A.G. should be locked up. Of course, they said it's unacceptable behavior, but because the book was published, reviewed widely, all the masks have come off. So the media has become insufferable, corporate media. Apart from a few mainstream papers which are not owned by corporations, there's very little possibility of getting stuff in. Even when they get stuff in, they then attack the people who provided them with the material in the first place. Because these people are saying, why aren't you publishing everything we demand?
Yeah.
So this is the sort of strange atmosphere we live in which democracy itself as a political process is being hollowed out. And so it's in that context that we have to see what is happening to Bradley Manning. This book, which has just been published by an American civil liberties lawyer, Chase Maddow, The Passion of Bradley Manning, actually tells the story. It's at the back of the bookstore. Tells the story extremely well. It's a very good little book for people who want to follow the whole story of what happened. But essentially, this is a story about a war which went very badly wrong, which is why this committee was set up. A war which initially was supported by a bulk of the mainstream press. And then once the occupation of Iraq began, even those newspapers which had initially been hostile to the war began to de facto accept the occupation. And this is the war in which we still don't have the exact figures of how many people were killed. The figures given by the Iraqi government under the occupation, one figure which was approved, passed by a government department, said we now have 5 million orphans in Iraq. 5 million. And just going on the basis, the guy who was a big advisor is a Cold War hack. The people who make the choice are all retired politicians. And the only is which establishment figure we can honor. That is what they think. They were, thinking of giving Bush and Blair. Oh no, I'm not joking. Finally, there was such an outcry that they stopped it. They gave Kissinger the Peace Prize. At which many satirists said we can no longer write. So that is what they do. But it's good to keep the pressure up.
Do go to the back there. I'm also now very pleased to welcome our next speaker, Birgitta Jonsdottir. She is a Member of Parliament in Iceland for the Pirate Party and has 2 particular qualifications for speaking here this evening. One is that it's Birgitta who is responsible for initiating the drive for Bradley to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. So that was Birgitta's initiative. And secondly, since she has been an MP herself, she has in fact been a volunteer for WikiLeaks. So you'll bring much to the meeting, I'm sure. Birgitta, welcome.
Thank you for being here and for caring about Bradley Manning and yours. I come from the background of helping with the video, help produce Collateral Murder. I hope everyone that's in here has seen it. Yes. If not, please watch it again, just to get the energy to carry on with your fight to stop the war. I also helped organize protests before the Iraq War in Iceland, and we nearly stopped it. We were so close. And this is precisely the reason why I chose to help with the video. It was my task to look through every pic of the video, to pull out the stills, so that the journalists would actually have the correct stills, because we knew that this would be probably the the most important global story we could provide to you. Because it showed us what all these people in Iraq never have been able to show us, how their lives has been day to day. And then there were the Afghan warlords, and then there were the Iraq warlords, and then there were the Guantanamo Bay logs on how the people are treated there. And then we got the cables, which showed us how not only Ham, he really needs us as well, and Barrett Brown, and of course Snowden, we need to keep an eye on him, and of course his sons. So with that note, I just want to thank everybody that is.
I promised Pete I'm only going to go for 5 minutes, so I crossed out half of what I had written down. So what I'm going to focus on is particularly the whole issue of whistleblowing, and really think about whistleblowing as an issue and where we can take it from here. Because in the UK, we've got the Public Interest Disclosure Act of 1998, that we do have, however imperfect it might be, a framework of legal protection. And when you look around the world, it's interesting when you start to look at the list, countries that have similar legislation. New Zealand, South Africa, Ghana, South Korea, Uganda, Jamaica, Canada only for public sector people. There's a law for the Indian Upper House. The European Court of Human Rights ruled in 2008 that whistleblowing is protected as freedom of expression. And then you get to the United States. Now it has some special protection for government employees and contractors who report waste and fraud. There's special protection for money. There's not special protection for human rights. And I think if we think about the history, it's probably not hard to see how it got to that point. If you think back to the Vietnam War, you think of some of the great work journalists did in exposing just what was happening on the ground in the Vietnam War. I think all of us can think of some of the horrific photos that came out of the Vietnam War. And what we've seen since then is the American military and the intelligence community has been utterly focused on controlling very, very tightly how the information gets out about them and how they're covered. Now my background is I'm also not really a professional politician, I'm a journalist by trade, and I used to work for the Guardian Weekly. And as a journalist, I know what it was like in the Iraq and Afghan wars, talking to foreign correspondents, people who had really good intentions and were trapped in that circumstance of being embedded, where you were entirely under control of the unit you were reporting on. And so that's the kind of framework that we have. And it's very telling that the US has no real whistleblower protection beyond protecting money. Now, that's the context we need to think about at the moment. Now, I think Nobel Peace Prize is a great idea, and I think that's really worth pushing and driving on. But I think we do need to think in that broader context, as other speakers have said this evening, thinking about Edward Snowden. And, I don't think, Russia has given him refuge for a year. It's Russia. That situation isn't necessarily, it's not where you'd like it to be. When he was still sitting there in the Moscow airport, I called on the European Union to actually take action to find him a safe place of asylum. And that is clearly, the European Union learned an awful lot about what its friend and ally was doing through what Edward Snowden exposed. And there really should be a responsibility to the EU to sort that out. Now, the list that I came up with was the French, the German, and the Finnish Green parties all called for their individual countries to provide Edward Snowden with asylum. Some people said that I should have said that the UK should provide asylum, but quite frankly, it really didn't seem like a very safe option to me. So I called for the EU to sort it out instead because I thought that was a better option. But we have to think about these in a broader context, and others have been mentioned this evening too. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the International Criminal Court. And now, however imperfect it might be, however much it might fail to deliver on what it should be doing, it will be an international body that will attempt, if a state can't take action on war crimes, will attempt to take action. And so I think we need to start to how we can ensure that whistleblowers can get international protection, that we can actually have an international framework that says that whistleblowers can get that protection. And I think it's interesting, Tariq was talking about how times have changed. And one of the things we're seeing, and that Edward Snowden particularly has exposed, is how much the new technologies are enabling the state to spy on us, to have total oversight over every citizen. But there's another side to that. And the other side of that is the fact that there is vast amounts of information about what states are doing, which you can pretty well fit on a USB key. Very flexible, very accessible, can be taken out. So there is actually, whilst we have huge new possibilities for states to restrict freedoms, we also have huge possibilities now, which were never there before, to utterly expose what states are doing. And I think if we're going to take advantage of that, we've got to make sure not only that we stand in solidarity with the people who've acted now, but we create a framework that gives people confidence that they can act in future and that there will be protections in future. And we've got to start work on making that happen. And I think that's something we should be looking forward to now, that we get out there and start to make it happen. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Natalie. Our next speaker is Chris Nineham, Vice Chair of the Stop the War Coalition. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, as other speakers have said, thanks very much to everyone for turning out tonight. It's a fantastic display of solidarity and concern, and it's very, very encouraging. I want to make a few comments about the broader context and about the connection between the whole sorry yet inspiring saga of Bradley Manning and some of the other whistleblowers. And I want to talk about the connections between what they've done and the wider war on terror, because as Tariq said, the whole sequence of events is a direct product of not just the war on terror in general, but the failure and the disaster that it has indeed created. Because reading Bradley Manning's testimony to court, which I hope some of you have done, I recommend it if you haven't. And by the way, it's a document which, in sort of characteristically Kafkaesque terms, very nearly got suppressed by the kind of mad and bureaucratic and secret process that is what passes for justice in this particular case. But the feeling you get when you read his words is that he is a witness to both the very worst and the very best of the experience of the last 12 years of the war on terror. He has, of course, done more than any other individual to expose the catastrophic brutality, the deceit, the illegality that is at the heart of the various wars that have been pursued by our government and by the US and its allies in the last decade or more. And actually, to those who say, he's added nothing to the understanding of those wars, I would say quite simply this. If they knew already the level of illegality, if they knew about the civilian killings, the targeted assassinations, the torture, and the various other abuses, how come they weren't shouting about it on the rooftops from the start? And I think anyone who's seen the collateral murder video, and anyone who's read even some of the various different leaks that Manning was responsible for, knows full well that he's done a huge service to humanity in exposing just the darkness at the heart of the war. In fact, hypocrisy is a word that's used very often and widely about the way that Manning has been treated. It seems in a way too lame a word to describe a situation in which a man who has exposed the kind of deceit and the secrecy and the appalling brutality at the heart of the war, and that he is actually being incarcerated as a spy. he's the absolute opposite, it seems to me, of a spy. There's no spy in history who has done what Bradley Manning actually describes his own work as, which is to generate worldwide debate and reform. That's not the role of a spy. A spy is someone who's involved in a competition for power, who's involved in secret dealings at the level of the nation state. This is a man who has done his utmost to defend humanity and to promote completely different values from those that are being pursued by the Western powers. And of course, the reason why hypocrisy seems like too weak a word to describe the way that he's been treated is that the kind of behaviour that has been meted out to Bradley Manning flows directly from the logic, from the whole process of the war on terror. For all the rhetoric of humanitarianism, for all the rhetoric of freedom and even fighting against terror, we all know that in its soul, the war on terror has never been about democracy, it's never been about freedom, it's never been about liberation, it's never really been about dealing with the issue of terror. It's always been, from the start, about control, about domination, and about, in fact, the pursuit and the promotion of US and Western hegemony around the world. And I think it's very important that we hold on to that point and to that fact, because the war isn't finished. The war hasn't gone away, despite the catastrophes of Iraq and Afghanistan. Incredibly, the Western powers, including our own government, are continuing to pursue these wars, repackaged, rebranded under Obama with a different set of strategies, but nevertheless every bit as brutal as the wars that were conducted under Bush and under Blair. And I think just to restate the fact that these wars have nothing to do with liberation, that they are about corporate power, that they are about promoting the interests of the West is very important. We were told that the Western operation in Libya was about trying to stop a massacre. The result, of course, was the death of tens of thousands of people unnecessarily, directly due to the Western bombardment. We're being told today that the arming of the rebels in Syria is about democracy, is about getting rid of a dictator, again, about, incredibly, stopping a massacre. We're being told that the continuing bombardment, barely reported by an increasing number of drone attacks in Yemen, directly promoted and championed by Barack Obama, is actually about democracy once again. It's about stopping the extremists from taking over. In fact, all of these policies were, from the very start, in different ways, designed to promote the interests of the Western powers and of US imperialism. And the result, of course, continues to be the world now believe that the war on terror has been a mistake, that it's been a disaster, and that these policies should actually be ended. And there's an opinion poll in Britain that came out a couple of months ago that actually said that 75% of the British population not just opposed the current wars, not just believed that what happened in Iraq was a catastrophe, but actually believed that Britain's foreign policy needs to change 180 degrees, and that Britain should stop being a country that believes it should have the right to intervene militarily in different parts of the world. And that's a very, very important fact. And it's important because it really tells us that we do have the power to change things, that we're not isolated, we're not marginal, that meetings like this can take place in many different parts of the world, but that actually we reflect not just an activist minority, but we reflect the opinion of the majority of society. And I think that's a very important second lesson that we need to draw from Bradley Manning. He's exposed the horrors of war in a way no other individual has done. But he expresses a humanity, he expresses another way of thinking about the world that is shared by millions of people. And I think we owe it to Bradley Manning, I think we owe it to Edward Snowden, we owe it to the other whistleblowers, and we owe it to the people of the Middle East and Central Asia and the people of Africa who are on the front line of the war on terror, who have suffered almost unimaginably from the wars that have taken place in our name over the last 12 years. we owe it to them to do everything in our power to turn that opinion into a given fact. And as Big Eater said, I think it's also important to hold on to the fact that back in 2003, the mobilisations against the Iraq War came close to stopping the Bush-Blair project. That level of opposition caused chaos in Washington. It caused a crisis actually in Whitehall amongst the elites. It made them think very carefully. We nearly came to the situation where Blair was forced to peel off from the war on terror. They want to take that history away from us. They want to make us believe that individuals who stand up are isolated, are marginal, can be incarcerated, can be suppressed. They can put Edward Snowden, they can put Bradley Manning in prison, they can isolate Edward Snowden, but there's no way that they can silence people in the world. We owe it both to them and to the people who are suffering from these wars to make sure that we keep the campaign going. Not just the campaign to defend Bradley Manning, but the campaign against further wars. I urge you all to continue this campaign, to sign the petition, to make sure the petition is circulated, but also to continue our fight for a world of peace and justice. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris, and again, thanks to the Stop the War Coalition for putting on this rally at such short notice. It's a great pleasure now to introduce someone who I think is probably our most tenacious and outspoken of human rights campaigners, Peter Tatchell.
It's a great pleasure to join you here tonight, and what a fantastic turnout this is. It shows from the Nuremberg judgment that it is never since then a defence in international law to say that I was following orders. Nuremberg established the principle, the Nuremberg Tribunal established the principle that merely following orders is not a defence. That each and every soldier is responsible for what they personally do. And that committing war crimes and crimes against humanity is in all circumstances illegal and punishable under law. So that's the tradition of Bradley Manning, the honourable good soldier who refused to go along with misdeeds and war crimes. And he has now paid a price, already over 3 years in prison, and many more years of prison awaiting him. I think it says a lot about him as a man, as a person, that he was prepared to take a risk and do what he did, knowing the potential consequences. I wonder if I, or any of us, would have had the courage to do what he did, knowing that we could face a potentially capital charge and 100+ years in prison. There are not many people in this world who have that kind of courage. And I think people like Bradley Manning, Edward Snowden, and others, those who have such courage, deserve our respect, support, and solidarity, which is why we're here tonight. As a small aside, as we all know, Bradley Manning is a US citizen, but also by default a British citizen by his Welsh mother. And what I found extraordinary and shameful is that our government, in all the months he was in detention in Quantico, Virginia military prison, being abused, as far as we know, Nick Clegg and David Cameron did nothing and said nothing about his fate and mistreatment. What a damning indictment of this government which professes a commitment to human rights. When it comes to how Bradley Manning was originally motivated to act, some of you will know the story, some of you won't, so I'll just repeat it here briefly. What first his disillusionment with US policy in Iraq was a series of events that happened in October 2009, when, as a military intelligence analyst, he discovered US military collusion with the repression and abuse of dissenters in Iraq. In particular, in one incident, he saw 15 Iraqi detainees being taken by the Iraqi Federal Police for the crime of, quote, printing what was alleged to be anti-Iraqi literature. In fact, these Democrats and dissidents who were challenging some of the policies of the then Iraqi government, the repressive policies of that government. And in particular, the offending leaflets for which they were arrested and abused and tortured exposed corruption in the US-backed government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. When Bradley Manning complained that US forces should not be suppressing these dissident voices who are exposing corruption and human rights crimes, he was told to keep quiet. He was told to say nothing, to do nothing. And he was admonished that it was the duty of the US armed forces to carry on and cooperate with the al-Maliki regime. That's what first made Bradley Manning think twice about what was going on, and led him to question other aspects of US war policy. I think he did the right thing. We think he did the right thing. Much of the world thinks he did the right thing. Another small aside, as many of you know, Bradley Manning is an LGBT equality campaigner and has attended and supported many protests. US military policy of don't ask, don't tell, in support of marriage equality, in support of equal rights in the workplace. Do you know that today in the United States, there is no federal law that prohibits discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in employment? There is no federal protection, even to this day. The Employment Non-Discrimination Bill has been languishing in Congress for years. This great democracy, so-called, cannot pass a law that protects people against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Anyway, as you also probably know, when he was in detention, Bradley Manning was, among other abuses, subjected to homophobic abuse, aspersions on his sexuality, his gender identity, the use of overt homophobic threats and abuse by some of the very officers who were involved and testified at his trial. I think that it is a great discredit to the US military and the US government that the people who perpetrated, when the Guardian report appeared, it made little play of that aspect and a great play that he was allegedly confused about his gender identity and his sexuality, that he was emotionally and mentally unstable. I think that was absolutely appalling from a so-called liberal newspaper. When we look at overall at this trial that's just concluded, the verdict that has been dealt, but not yet consented, what I found remarkable was that President Obama, even before Bradley Manning came to trial, declared his guilt. Even before the trial began, President Obama was collared by an activist at a meeting and said he broke the law. Not he allegedly broke the law, or he may have broken the law, he broke the law. How is it that a lawyer like Barack Obama could have no fundamental respect for the principle of innocent until proven guilty? I mean, Obama's own statement was almost enough to invalidate the prosecution, in my opinion. And if it had been done in this country, it probably would have. Of course, this is just the tip of the critique of President Barack Obama. A man who has hounded more whistleblowers than even Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Unbelievable. A man who has pursued more drone strikes in Pakistan than even George W. Bush. The man of hope, the man of vision, the man of a different course for America has turned out to be the same old, same old, same old. And in some respects worse. In some respects worse. What is truly shocking about the drone attacks is they're part of a pattern. The United States and the British government have for years and years and years supported right-wing extremist elements in Pakistan. The military dictator, Pervez Musharraf, was actively, overtly supported by successive American presidents and British prime ministers. When all those attacks are happening in places like Balochistan, where the Pakistan military is waging a genocidal war against the people, they are doing so with American-supplied Cobra attack helicopters and F-16 fighter craft. Britain is supplying some of the parts, communications equipment for that secret, dirty war in Balochistan. And that war in Balochistan, of course, is part of a pattern of wider attacks on human rights all across the Pakistan region, against the Pashtun people, against people in Sindh. This nation, which gets so much Western aid, has been responsible for so many internal crimes against humanity. And President Obama has continued that process of arming the Pakistan state, working with the ISI, the intelligence service, which is implicated in mass human rights abuses against many, many dissident sections of Pakistan society. There is collusion between the British and American security services with the ISI in Pakistan. Why are we aiding a regime that is terrorizing and persecuting its own citizens? Why are we aiding a regime that has colluded with the Taliban to suppress democratic, secular, and left-wing opposition? All across Pakistan, Democrats, secularists, left-wingers, and others are being terrorized, beaten, abducted. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Pakistani citizens are disappearing and never ever being seen again, thanks to the policy of the Pakistani military and intelligence services, aided and abetted by the British and American government. So this is just another small fragment of the manifold failures of the Obama administration, which the hounding of Edward Manning are a further aspect. I'm so glad that we are here tonight, and there are meetings taking place other nights in other parts of the country and around the world, where millions of people are saying these policies, these failed war and terror policies, these failed houndings of individuals who are speaking out, these have got to stop. At the end of the day, history will judge. History will judge. It will judge Obama harshly. It will revere people like Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden. And all the others who've stood up for the principles of peace, justice, liberty, and a world without war. Those people will go down in history as the true icons, the true voices of people worldwide who believe and hope that we can have a world where democracy, human rights, and peace prevail. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jeremy Corbyn.
Question of whether the Austin Unionists followed and obeyed the law
what, and what in Northern Ireland. And then I replied by giving them just a short soupçon of all the oppressive laws that were used in Northern Ireland, the Emergency Powers Act, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the Diplock Court, internal without trial, the broadcasting ban, the travel ban, and all those things. And people in Northern Ireland stood up against that attack on their as many Irish people in this country stood up against that attack on their liberties, and eventually massive political change has taken place. But the attack on our liberties goes back a very long way and becomes more intense. When the Prevention of Terrorism Act was passed in 1974 in record time in a fevered atmosphere in Britain, 10,000 Irish people were arrested, interrogated, and I think 1% were charged or something like that, maybe not as many as that. And then that morphed into the and then after 2001, there's been a steady attack on the civil liberties of people all over Europe, North America, and indeed all over the world. Guantanamo Bay is the most obvious example of the totally illegal nature both of the wars and the approach being taken by the Western countries to those wars, the extraordinary rendition, the lies that were told to the British Parliament and many others about extraordinary rendition, and the way in which the quasi-secret state in every European country colluded with the extraordinary rendition, whether their governments knew about it or not. And there is some reason to believe that in some cases the national governments of countries that were part of extraordinary rendition didn't even know it was going on. As CIA flights came in the dead of night and went out in the dead of night at jurisdiction after jurisdiction. So Shakarama and so many other cases are really all part of this whole issue of the attack on liberties because of war and terror has been conducted and the effect that it's having on all of us. As far as I'm concerned, I agree with everything that has been said about Bradley Manning, a man whose politics I knew nothing of and have only read about. I've never had the good fortune to meet him, and he signed up to work in the US military and be a surveillance officer, and that sort of tends to suggest a certain political outlook and a certain level of loyalty he must have had to that system. Yet something broke within him at a point, and this I think is what is so interesting about him. He just said, we cannot go on lying, we cannot go on condoning the torture and abuse of human rights that's happening in Iraq and so many other places, and he blew the whistle on it, and he is paying a terrible price for it. And I absolutely agree with the point that Peter and Chris made earlier on, that Bradley Manning is 136 years and more likely to get a prison sentence. Should he ever be in a position to be pushed in front of a court anywhere in the world, I'm sure Julian Assange would end up before a US court and get something even worse, if not the death penalty, Edward Snowden, the like of it. And so all those people who stood up to try to make sure the rest of the world knew what's happening, we all owe them a debt. And that debt is our solidarity. And that debt is repaid by our campaign for their release. So let's get to it and build that campaign as strongly as we possibly can. But also the point about the culpability of those that have taken us into war, of Blair, of Bush, of Kissinger, and of so many others. Not one of those has faced any serious legal threat at all so far. Yet the International Criminal Court is quite good at taking up cases of non-European and non-North American jurisdictions. I'm not defending human rights abusers anywhere in the world. A human rights abuser is a human rights abuser, and that is what we campaign for international law to deal with. But it seems a little strange when those that have ordered carpet bombing, illegal imprisonment, extraordinary rendition, torture, and all the other things that are wholly illegal within international law, and certainly in the case of every European country, illegal within their own legal system, none of those have faced any justice whatsoever so far. So those that tell the truth end up in prison.
those that tell lies are able to be paid a large amount of money, in the case of Blair, by international mining companies in order to continue the oppression of civil rights in this country. And the last point I want to make is this. The most recent piece of legislation that was pushed through the House of Commons in a usual way in which any kind of attack on civil liberties is put forward is that the government says they've got concerns. The House of Commons Security Committee says it's got deep concerns. Somebody in the House of Lords says they've got extraordinarily deep concerns. And then various lawyers are trotted out to say that we all support human rights, civil liberties, independence of the judiciary, and it's what's made Britain the great country it is, our respect for international law and independence of the individual and so on and so on. But on this occasion, because of the extraordinary threat that we face and the difficulties of getting cases into court, we've got to do something different. So we're having closed courts, the secret court procedure. Now, why are we having a secret court procedure? Because when an individual, in Libya in this case, who was taken there at the time when Britain was getting on very well with Gaddafi, and he turned out to be an opponent of Gaddafi, well, they knew that, that's why they sent him back there. He then was eventually released and then sought to prosecute the British government. Now, he was going to call in evidence, he'd been absolutely entitled to do, the security services, and he could name the individuals concerned who had taken part in this extraordinary and disgusting act of totally illegal rendition of that particular individual. And there are many more. So Kenneth Clarke, ever the Liberal, says, well, you've got to be pragmatic about these things. It's going to cost us £25 million to throw with these people, or we can have a secret court procedure and we can get away with it and it'll just be the cost of the court. So Hobson's choice, really. What do you do? You know, I mean, do you lock somebody up, or or do you just shut up about it and have a secret court? So what have we got? Secret courts in this country. We've always had some process of secrecy in the judicial process, but this secret courts process is an extraordinarily dangerous one and will be used against people who are victims of the war on terror, victims of the complicity of this country with the US war on terror, and that will end up with those people facing often very long prison sentences in some jurisdiction or other. And it means that, as ever, the British security services, just like the CIA and others, will be totally unaccountable. Their actions will not be held to account. They cannot be taken to court for it. There cannot be any sense of openness about it. So when we campaign, what we're doing is lifting the lid on the whole murky world in which the truth is turned upside down. The lies become the truth becomes the lies, and very brave people end up in prison. So I want to say big thank you to Ecuador for being prepared to offer asylum. If you think about it, Ecuador is not in a very powerful position. It's not a very big country. It is in Latin America. The US, or many people in the US, still consider Ecuador to be part of their own backyard. And the retribution, the economic and political retribution against Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia, and any other country that pokes its head above the parapet is very dangerous and very great indeed. So we're here tonight to understand the issue. We're here tonight to campaign. We're also here to recognise that certain people at certain times do extraordinary things. And thank goodness for that, and thank goodness they do. Let's stand with them and make sure more extraordinary things happen to bring this disgusting, systematic, worldwide attack on our liberties, which is going on at the moment. Thank you.
Now, before I introduce our final speaker, stop the wall, colleagues, our buckets at the ready. We're going to have a collection now obviously this costs money to put on this rally this evening, but also we need to collect money in order to continue our work in support of Bradley Manning and against wars and injustice that continue to be perpetrated by our government. So please give generously. There's also a clipboard going round. I see it at the front there. That's if you wish to be kept in touch with Stop the War and its activities. If you wish to join us in our campaigning, please do put your name and contact details there. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, thanks very much for that. If you could take your seats again, so I can introduce our final speaker. It's a great pleasure to welcome the United States author and peace activist.
Where Bradley Manning has sat all summer. You could travel a few dozen kilometers and 45 years back to another federal courthouse in Maryland, where 9 defendants sat after visiting a conscription draft board and taking hundreds of files into the parking lot and burning them with napalm as the war in Vietnam continued. One of those defendants in the dock, Daniel Ellsberg, or rather Daniel Berrigan was to say, our apologies, good friends, for burning paper instead of children. 4.5 decades later, a similar sort of apology, if you can call it that, is in the air from Bradley Manning. Forgive us, forgive me, for disclosing deadly secrets rather than keeping and perpetuating them. And that is, I think, really our situation today, where the warfare state equals the surveillance state. There is no difference in the United States, in Great Britain, or around the world. There is no difference between the warfare state and the surveillance state. They are one and the same. And we have not only the opportunity, but the necessity to recognize what we're truly dealing with in this historical era, and of course to develop the appropriate human response. People tonight have alluded to the truth that when Bradley Manning is told, well, now you must face the consequences, of course, the unasked question in the mainstream corporate mainline media and among establishment politicians is, well, what about George W. Bush and Tony Blair? What about Barack Obama and David Cameron? When do they face the consequences of their actions? Where do they face the consequences of the plunder of the well-being of so many people on the planet, mired in poverty while they are perpetuating the slaughter of war with the drones and the cruise missiles and the other intervention? That's in the air. And also in the air, with such serious consequences is what is so often called the special relationship. And I want to say something about that because we have people-to-people wonderful special relationships, and we have a special relationship between Downing Street and the White House, which is pernicious and toxic toward democracy and destructive of human rights around the world. And when I think of human rights and whistleblowers and the so-called special relationship, I think of a woman who, a decade ago, was about the age of Edward Snowden now. Her name is Catherine Gunn. And there she was at the computer terminal. Much as it's about everybody in our countries. It's about everybody who has an opportunity to recognize which door is open for us. Where is our possibility to be part of this renunciation of war and violence? It's the international cooperation that makes so much possible. And I want to close by recalling a statement by the 19th century abolitionists in the United States, visited with such devastating effects on people in our countries and around the world. But power, to resurrect an old saying, power of the people can be something very different, very different. I noticed that the literature coming from the Stop the War Coalition and on the website about this event tonight, there's a wonderful graphic with Bradley Mann that says, he's in there for us, we're out here for him. And that, as to my knowledge, that saying was first applied to the labor organizer in the United States well a century or more ago, Joe Hill. Behind bars, he's in there for us, we're out here for him. And the other statement associated with Joe Hill most famously is, don't mourn, organize, and that's our future. Thank you very much.
Just before we close, Norman referred to the website. You can still sign on to the petition for Bradley to be